Hello, everybody. It is Eric Trexler. I'm here with the good Dr. Eric Helms. It is Monday night. It's 7 p.m. Eastern Time, and that means it is time for yet another edition, the 315th rendition of Iron Culture, presented by Mass. So episode 315, that's a huge threshold for us because that means we're officially at the 3-plate level. Okay, so in the lifting world, that's way more important than episode 300 or 200 or any other barrier you might want to hit. Once we get to episode 405, we're going to have to do something really, really special. But I tell you what, Helms, it's going to be a quick episode. We got about an hour here. We're going to dive in. We're going to make sure that we answer every question that could possibly be thought of in the chat. Before we get to that, we've got a question that came in our little after hours portal. And by the way, folks, if you can't catch us live on YouTube on Monday nights, you can always submit questions 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, 366 on leap years. And you can do that by going to massresearchreview.com/ironculture, one word. But we got 2 questions, actually 3 questions in a row on TRT from 3 totally different people. So this is, yeah. You got a question?
One obligated thing that we should talk about. If you like seeing us talk live, there is actually an opportunity. If you want to travel to Austin, Texas in April to see the entire team speak live at the Sports Nutrition Association conference. We have an annual conference. Myself and Dr. Eric Trexler, we are on the board for the SNA, but cool thing happening. Mass is sponsoring the event, meaning that Dr. Lauren Colenso-Semple and Dr. Mike Zerdos will also be there, along with a bunch of other amazing speakers, to include none other than YouTube sensation Jeremy Etier, and a whole bunch of others like Sean Arendt, Gabrielle Fendero, Lauren Conlin, and many others. And we're going to remind you guys of this on a weekly basis because this is one of those unique opportunities where we all get to speak in person. There's going to be Q&A. And there's going to be 2 days of presentations. So it's going to be an awesome opportunity if you're interested in furthering your own nutrition knowledge, or if you are looking to actually become a better coach in the nutrition space.
Yeah, good call. I'm really stoked about that event. It's coming up, like you said, in April. Even if you don't like fitness and you don't like anyone associated with Mass, interesting that you're listening and watching right now, but nonetheless, we'll take what we can get. But even if you don't like any of that crap, it is worth noting that Austin, Texas is a fun city. It's one of my favorite cities that I visited, and I'm interested to see how it's going to go this time because it was one of my favorite cities when I visited, but I visited many years ago when I was not vegetarian. One of my favorite things about this fun city was incredible Mexican food and incredible barbecue. Neither of those are particularly vegetarian friendly, but if any place can do it, I trust that Austin has something up its sleeve.
It can. Having been there multiple times for numerous 3DMJ get-togethers, I can tell you, also in my pescatarian, flexitarian phase, you can absolutely make it work. So Hot Dottie's has an amazing Impossible Burger. Tell you what.
All right. And if all else fails, you just go to the Lyndon Johnson Presidential Library Museum. I mean, what more could you want?
Also,
on that point, yeah, go ahead.
There's also the University of Austin, Texas's Stark Center, which is the entire history. This is why I've been there so many times. I've been 3 times now, of everything related to lifting. And there's a good reason why we've had numerous academics who are there. And the Iron Culture documentary, which is currently being edited, has interviews and footage there with Connor Heffernan, as well as some of the curators and academics who are housed there. So it's an amazing spot.
I heard that documentary was getting canned. I heard that they were just going to can that thing because it's very odd that I am noticeably absent. And as part of the core Iron Culture team, I think there's some pretty big issues associated with that.
Well, here's the thing. It was going to get canned until you made the very big mistake of acknowledging all Iron Culture content before you joined the team as canon, which actually took it. It was literally running the door out. Our legal team was like, listen, Trex is putting a lot of pressure on us. We have to get rid of this. And I said, folks, I've got the tapes. We played it. And they said, you know what? We're not sure that this strictly applies to non-podcast content. He was explicit Or was he? Because he said iron culture, but he didn't say necessarily iron culture podcast. So we took the liberty of applying that to mean all footage of the documentary, which did occur before you came on. And we are now good to go.
It'd be really interesting if you just released an audio-only version of this documentary. I don't know if it would quite hit the same note, but it would certainly put you in a better legal position. All right, Helms. Yes, that event is going to be awesome. We will remind people regularly. Hopefully people will come out and see us. But Helms, like I said, we got a question in the after hours portal. Actually, we got 3 questions all about TRT from 3 different people. And I've commented on this before, but it's one of those things. You can always tell what is kind of gaining traction in the online fitness content world, because it's like a video or something will get released, and literally these 3 questions from 3 different people came over a span of 6 minutes. So somebody made some content out there about TRT. But it looks like, generally speaking, these people asking the question are all kind of in the same place. And they have a few basic questions that kind of jump out as themes, right? So I'm going to put on my qualitative researcher hat and extract some themes from these questions. So one big question that is really emerging from this is like, when does somebody hit that point where they decide, I actually am going to go on TRT? Like my testosterone is low-ish. I feel like I'm managing all the lifestyle factors effectively that ought to put me in a higher testosterone range. So when do I make that call and say, I've done everything I can behaviorally, now I need to go the pharmacological route to get my testosterone to where I want it to be? So that's one big question. Another question is, basically, is it really, really scary to do this? Because once you go on TRT, everyone knows you will be on it forever. Now, Helms, right off the bat, something that you said when we were talking to Lauren Colenso-Semple, the good Dr. Lauren, about TRT stuff on the tail end of an episode that was largely about menopause. You had mentioned a statistic that really surprised me, and I think is definitely going to surprise the people asking these questions, which is that I think you said, what was it, 70%, 80%? 80% of men higher than 80?
Yeah, so there was a review done on TRT usage statistics. It is one review. It's not the definitive one. I think it was done in maybe 2017. Dr. Ben House, when he did his really well-liked episode on testosterone replacement therapy and all things about it, talked about there are 2 major issues. So there's 3. The first major issue is that there are literally affiliate codes out there for fitness influencers to recommend TRT clinics, and that the clearing the bar for what you need for a doctor to send you TRT is basically just a video consult where you say, I don't feel very good.
Yeah.
What the Endocrine Society recommends is multiple serial testing in the same conditions of testosterone to confirm this after presenting symptoms, not just because I think I might be low. Yeah. And then after those multiple tests confirm it, because of the reliability issues with one-off testing and the impact of diurnal variation, which is substantial, and recent energy balance, food intake, and all of these things, and individual differences, and also potentially differences in free testosterone, which is the actual testosterone, which may impact why you do or don't have symptoms, and the many overlapping symptoms that can come from other things that are not low testosterone with low testosterone, they recommend this serial testing. So issue 1, this is now a cottage industry that has invaded the fitness industry rather than health. 2, no one's doing the actual testing that is recommended. And then 3, this 2017 review, if I remember the statistic correctly, found that something like 85% of men in this review who had been on TRT were not on that same TRT a year later. Now, for those who actually think about this, what it means, and understand that testosterone replacement therapy is probably something you're going to be on long term if you commit to it, because you're dealing with clinically low testosterone, and there's no real way to deal with that if you're not, say, fixing something potentially through surgery. Like if you have one of these issues with the testicle that we talked about that can be removed surgically that could sometimes reduce testosterone, or if there is another clinical issue that you're dealing with in concert, potentially
sometimes
lifestyle factors.
Sometimes tumors can cause that. Yeah,
exactly. There's numerous things that you may be on TRT temporarily, but I would say they're the minority of times, and most of the time people going in, it's because they believe they're having an age-related decline in testosterone. So you would anticipate that the majority of the people who go on TRT would still be doing it if it was effective and if it fixed the issue that they came to the TRT clinic for a year later. But the fact that somewhere between 8 to 9 out of 10 men are not on TRT a year later perhaps indicates that because we're constantly marketed as soon as we hit the age of 30 these days, it seems like it's constantly dropping, that the boogeyman under the stairs of all your problems is low testosterone. I think there's a lot of men who maybe are depressed, anxious, have another issue physiologically, and because they're constantly being given a reason and what to attribute it to, that's what they look to. And frankly, I think there's a lot of guys who just would like to be more muscular and think it's also an easy way out. So it hits a lot of boxes, but it does not fix the problem, apparently, for almost 90% of men.
Yeah, so, and you're of the impression, it sounds like, that basically this shockingly high stat is related to people who try it and realize this isn't as great as I thought it would be, so there's no point anymore. Not things like losing access or affordability or anything like that. You think people are opting out of using it?
I think there's got to be some. I would think that the amount of those other things certainly are in place. I'm sure they contribute to that statistic. I would be shocked if they contributed the majority to that statistic. So I have a tough time seeing how that would not be a dominating factor.
Yeah. Yeah. So really interesting. And I think you're definitely correct. I think there's a lot of people who, there's a lot of marketing right now about that kind of convinces you, hey, you should go check your testosterone if you have any of these quote unquote symptoms that basically just represent like living in the modern world. Like, do you get sleepy sometimes? Do you feel like sometimes you got a lot on your plate? You might have low testosterone, and it kind of gives this impression that people who have higher testosterone live as if they were a lion. They attack each day with vigor and
100%.
Never have any wavering confidence or any sluggishness in their day. So yeah, I think you're definitely hitting the nail on the head that a lot of people probably try. They hop on TRT, they take a small dose of injectable testosterone, a tenth of what you're seeing in these like IFBB pro bodybuilders. It doesn't do much because that dose of testosterone really shouldn't do much. It doesn't do much also because they didn't have symptoms in the first place, so there's no symptoms to actually resolve, and they say, no thanks, this isn't really worth it. So I think that's a great point. And when it comes to this other question of, when would someone actually make that call? I think that call should be made in consultation with a qualified medical professional, not someone who says, I can get you this stuff.
Yeah.
If we do a Zoom call and you tell me that you're sleepy sometimes, So
a little bit of conflict of interest, would you say?
Yes. So you should do it when consulting with a physician who's not directly making their money on getting people to use TRT. So that's the first thing. And that individual will probably tell you, unless you actually have certain symptoms that are getting beyond light into the more moderate to severe category in terms of how you're feeling, lethargic, low libido, things of that nature. There should be some symptoms present before you really think about flipping that switch, and really before you even bother to test your testosterone levels, and then you should probably verify that your testosterone levels are actually low, and then that qualified medical professional can help you make that decision. But I think a lot of people really misunderstand, if the normal reference range for a young man, it'll vary by age and stuff like that. For a young man, generally, we're talking 300 to 1,000 nanograms per deciliter. You'll see slightly different ranges in different textbooks, whatever. But there's a lot of folks who will be like, I'm at 480, but I really see myself as being an 800 kind of guy. And it's like, right, but you're very comfortably within that reference range. You're not that far from the mean or the center of it. You have no symptoms. And if you want to go on TRT, who am I to stop you? But at the end of the day, you're probably not going to get much out of it. And you're probably going to be one of those 85% who do it for 6 months or a year and say, no, thanks. I'd rather not have a needle in my, shoulder, glute, leg, whatever, every week or whatever. So that's definitely something to consider. And the other thing I want to address before we move on is this idea that The moment you go on TRT, you will be on it forever. Helms, empirically, as you said, that doesn't seem to be the case, very far from the case. It's worth recognizing. I think this is, Helms, how many times have we talked about the bleed over from the maximalist IFBB steroid world and how it touches on so many things outside of that world, carbohydrate loading, and post-workout carbs, all these, shedding water before a natural bodybuilding competition. So many things that kind of leaked out of that world and permeated into contexts where they don't make sense. I am very skeptical that someone is going to permanently shut down their HPG axis if they go on ultra low dose TRT for 6 months. I am very skeptical of this pervasive belief that you go on TRT and the moment you take that first injection, you're on it for life no matter what, or you're doomed to a life of having your test at like 40 nanograms per deciliter for the rest of your life. Physiologically, it makes absolutely no sense. And I think people are largely getting that impression because they hear interviews from people who took 1.5 grams of testosterone for 35 years, and they're like, yeah, I'm on TRT for life now. You gotta understand that it's very different, the plight of being a high-level IFBB pro for 2.5 decades who's taking grams of stuff versus somebody who's taking 150 milligrams a week of one testosterone compound. It is a completely different situation. Now, that's not to say that people should take a decision lightly when it comes to introducing exogenous hormones into your body. It is something that ought to be considered very seriously, and you should talk to a physician about what the potential ramifications might be. But Helms, am I insane? That just doesn't seem like a plausible suggestion to me.
No, I completely agree. I don't have much to add, to be honest.
Yeah, and to be fair, a lot of reasons that you will hear a qualified medical professional make claims of that nature is because they assume you're doing it correctly. Oh, so for example, all your lifestyle factors are in check. You exercise, you're managing your weight, you're eating healthy, you're sleeping well, you're managing stress, and your testosterone as a 34-year-old man is at like 140 nanograms per deciliter. You are clearly outside of the typical reference range. A physician who puts you on testosterone replacement therapy is not thinking, let's give you a little boost and get your body fired up. That's not what they're thinking. The goal is, or the premise of that treatment is, your body is not producing testosterone. Us giving you testosterone is not going to convince it to. We are just going to give you the testosterone that your body seems to have permanently stopped making, or, permanently stopped making sufficient levels of, okay? So that is why you might hear a qualified professional say, yeah, TRT is TRT for life, because they're assuming you're there because you are way outside of the reference range and there's nothing that's going to bring you back, okay? And that's a very normal use case for TRT. So we've got these two different dueling ideas of why TRT is quote unquote a forever type decision. One is you think that you're blasting gear at a high level for 25 years, and that's not what it is. The other is, yeah, like TRT is generally, in most cases, for people who no longer produce sufficient levels of testosterone, and they will need to be on it forever if they want to have higher testosterone forever. That's pretty much it.
Absolutely. By the way, I wanted to fact check myself.
Okay.
The paper, the effects of testosterone on body composition in obese men are not sustained after cessation of testosterone treatment. That is by Tang Fui. I'm probably mispronouncing that. 2017 in Clinical Endocrinology. You can absolutely check that out, and I would encourage people to do so. And it is 80 to 85%. So I took the high value, so I was a little biased. Apologies. Okay.
That's why they call you biased, Helms.
That's what they call
me. I see that all
me.
over. All right, Helms, I think clearly there was an interest for TRT, so I'm not going to apologize for addressing it thoroughly, but let's dive into the chat for people who frankly do not give a damn about TRT. You mentioned over in the Iron Culture YouTube page, we had some really good questions. What do you got there?
We got several. One of them I'm going to kick over to you that was basically asking about, hey, what's the recent data on citrulline malate? And I think there was a follow-up question that was specifically asking, hey, is the malate component important, or can I just get by on L-citrulline?
Okay, I'm going to admit something that I shouldn't, but I will.
Oh, no.
A lot of people, if you're going through grad school, people say choose your dissertation topic carefully because this will be the focus of your adult life from the age of 28 to 78 or until they put you in the casket. I honestly don't read a lot of citrulline literature anymore, even though it was the topic of my dissertation. I haven't written about it for a couple years, and so I haven't been bothered to kind of dive back into the literature. And we were kind of getting to what I would consider a pretty steady state with the literature of pretty much seeing what we were seeing from citrulline. And my view on citrulline from the last time I dug in, which was a couple years ago, I basically stopped writing about it in mass because every article was the same thing. It was like, yeah, it looks like this has a trivial to small effect size, and sometimes it doesn't work, but more often than not, it has an effect size of around 0.2-ish or a little higher. And that's kind of what we're seeing with it. So my view of citrulline is it seems to be in that class of ergogenic aids that certainly you can call it a good like tier 2 evidence-based supplement. There's enough out there to say I can make a case based on science that this thing actually does what it's supposed to do, which is mostly increase strength endurance, get you a few extra reps here and there. Now, the question about malate, this is something that I've really wrestled with. What's really tricky is we don't know a ton about like optimal dosing of citrulline malate, in my opinion, because kind of the first study that really hit the research with resistance training gave like that classic 6 or 8 grams of citrulline malate. Who knows if it was a 1-to-1 or 2-to-1 ratio of citrulline to malate? No one seems to report that, which is a major issue. And then even the people who do report it, it's typically not true if you actually independently test the samples themselves. So basically, we got into this rut where all the citrulline literature used the same dose, roughly 6 to 8 grams, and they all used citrulline malate because that's just what had been done. And so there's not really a lot of super clear evidence, very rigorously with high statistical power, comparing citrulline versus the combination of citrulline and malate. But there's really no good physiological explanation for why malate would really be bringing anything to the party. And for that reason, I'm pretty skeptical that malate's doing anything. And we do have studies where citrulline alone seems to improve a variety of different types of performance. Yeah, I think the malate honestly is just along for the ride. One nice thing about it is it does contribute to the nice flavor of citrulline malate. It gives it that really nice citrusy kind of tang. And what's really great about that is you mix it with something sweet and you get this really lovely, like, I have a buddy who's a dietitian, and he would actually mix citrulline into his like flavored water throughout the day just because he liked it. It had nothing to do with the performance effects. So yeah, that's kind of still where I'm at with citrulline. Is it seems to have a very modest effect, which may be valuable to you based on your goals and the type of training you do. And whether you go citrulline or citrulline malate, in my opinion, it doesn't seem to matter.
Great answer. And yeah, I think one of the things I would really like to see in this area is more long-term research. This is a consistent thing. It's just so logistically feasible to do short-term effect studies on supplements to see how they impact resistance training performance. But I would really love to see whether that eventuates into lean body mass gains, which, believe it or not, there's like 1 or 2 studies on caffeine, a bunch on creatine, and almost nothing besides that, at least in the realm of where we have a compound that we think is actually potentially beneficial. So citrulline, malate, beta-alanine, I would like to see for both of them. It's actually a little bit on beta, but...
Yeah, the nice thing with beta-alanine is that everyone generally agrees that you have to take it for weeks. So most of the studies do at least give you that, that kind of timeline. But yeah, I will say 3 areas where I'd love to see the supplement research expand. You nailed it. We definitely need longer term stuff with citrulline. That was actually part of my dissertation plan originally, but the timeline got truncated and we had to cut the training study, which, darn it. I wish I could have spent my whole life in the gym for 6 months. But yeah, so we snipped that to make it a little more feasible. But because my timeline for graduation got truncated a little bit. But we definitely need to see that. I'd really like to see more of this stuff with beta-alanine alternatives for acute use. So, different carnosine-related compounds. I think they mix carnosine and anserine together, which is naturally a combination you'll find in chicken broth. And there's been some research to suggest that basically you can saturate the carnosinase enzyme that normally makes carnosine supplementation acutely worthless. And so it's basically like a short-acting alternative to beta-alanine, which makes a lot more sense in a pre-workout formula, which is the most common place people get their beta-alanine. So I'd really like to see more of that stuff. There's only really one lab I've seen that's been doing it. I think that, like I said, is just a much more intuitive path for these really popular pre-workout formulas. And another thing I'd like to see is some longer-term research on betaine for hypertrophy. Jason Kaliva's done a little bit, and nobody's really picked up the ball from where he left it. And so I'd like to see people get more into that. The only reason I'm so intrigued by it is because there's little hints in the literature that it might do something, specifically in terms of hypertrophy. And more importantly, there are multiple species of livestock where farmers supplement feed with betaine. And of course, livestock animals are different than humans. I'm not suggesting that it will necessarily translate, but there's not that much stuff that you can just put in the feed of livestock and make them much more muscular and leaner. And that seems to be what betaine does. And when you are dealing with an industrial-sized farm, you don't do the 19-year-old fitness enthusiast thing and say, I'll throw this supplement in, I'll throw that supplement in. We're talking about very, very substantial costs when you're feeding 400 cattle and 600 pigs or whatever your farm size is. So the fact that people keep making that investment and really believe that it's dramatically impacting meat yield to the extent that it's worth that large investment, I think that's something worth considering personally. Farmers don't mess around with their feed. Like, they are really, the impression I get is that they have to be very, very shrewd with exactly what the expenditure is on the feed, because it is such a huge compounding cost when you consider the size of a lot of these, the scale of this farming. So yeah, I don't think people flippantly will just sprinkle in a moderately expensive supplement.
No, I would also like to see more research on betaine. I took it for a while to experiment with it a couple of years back. Like almost all supplements, I don't think it was a large enough effect for me to notice anything.
Yeah.
Stacking up small effects that perhaps can't be viewed in an anecdotal way is kind of the name of the game when it comes to high performance sport.
Yeah. And also, I want to be clear. I'm not saying I'm certain it's going to work and I'm just waiting for someone to give me the evidence. I don't know if it's going to work, but I think it's intriguing enough to bother with, when you, especially like,
it's worth
there's
testing.
So many supplement trials happening that we don't need. Like, somebody do the betaine study.
For sure. 100%.
Yeah. All right. What else do we have in the iron culture chat?
We got one that I think I can tackle. How do you quantify volume of time-saving techniques like myo-reps and rest pause sets? I've seen Helms mention that drop sets equal about 75% of straight sets. Do you believe it might be similar? This is from CW. Great question. And I think the main thing to remember is that there is a distinction that is pretty important between drop sets and rest pause. Is that when you're doing drop sets, and there's actually two meta-analyses on these that are almost identical. They were kind of done at the same time by two different groups, and they came to similar conclusions, which is a good sign. They're not on a tremendous number of studies, but I want to say it's maybe 6 or 7. And they both found that you could get similar outcomes in terms of hypertrophy from doing drop sets compared to straight sets. But the important thing is that if you look at the total number of straight sets that are performed in these groups compared to the total number of drop sets plus that initial sets, you're doing more work, or more sets, I should say, to get to the same place with drop sets. Because you're basically just doing an extended set. So you are seeing force production fall off, which means the tension level is lower, and you're kind of doing a past fatigue approach. So the per set stimulus is lower, but what you're losing, you're gaining in time efficiency so long as you can handle that fatigue. Because if you were to do 1 set, then 3 drops, and that's roughly equivalent to 4 sets if you kind of look at the comparison in these metas, it just takes you basically 2 seconds to put the selectorized machine or swap out the dumbbells you're using, and then you're going for 30 seconds and then 20, 20, 20. So you can get 1 to 2 minutes to get the equivalent of 3 straight sets, which is going to take you, just with rest periods, 4 minutes. So it's a 50% or more time saving, right? Cutting your workout time in half. Rest pause is fundamentally different. What you're doing is you're not reducing load and you're resting until you then do more reps. So typically there's a initial activation set. With myo reps, you typically stop short of failure. With rest pause in the literature, you're hitting failure, and that's not the way you have to do it. And you're resting 20 or 30 seconds. It's just what's done in the research. Think about it. If you were to do, say, 3 by 10 versus a set of 10, and then rest pauses until you got an additional 20 reps at the same load, and this was all to failure in both conditions. In the 3 by 10 to failure condition, and let's say it's like 10, 9, 8, you wouldn't be able to do 10, 10, 10 to failure. You're going to have 3 or 4 grindy reps per set, right? That are slow velocity, high contraction forces, fatigue generating. It's hard. When you do the rest pause, there's that initial set, and then everything after that is extremely challenging. So you're going to end up getting 4 or 5 times as many total reps that are at a slow velocity, generating fatigue and quite hard. So it is probably true that you don't need to do as many total reps when you're doing a rest pause scheme to get to a similar outcome as you would with straight sets. But I have not seen any effective way to quantify what that is yet. And most of the time what people do is they use rest pause to equal the same volume, but that actually increases the stimulus and fatigue. So just be aware of that. Yeah, you could probably do less total reps. How much? Don't know. And that if you match reps, you will probably get more fatigue and maybe a greater stimulus, but that has not been well quantified. So when it comes to time-saving techniques, I tend to favor drop sets as well as antagonist paired sets and peripheral paired sets, because that way it's a little easier to compare like to like.
Good stuff, Helms. We got a couple in the Mass Channels live chat that I think are right up your alley. So one of them that comes to mind, I didn't know this, but someone said that apparently, Helms, you struggled with a bit of tendinopathy. Is this accurate? Is this true?
In the past, yeah. At times I've had a little bit of tennis elbow.
Okay.
Or wait, is it golfer? Golfer's elbow is the inside, tennis elbow is the outside, right?
Yeah, because tennis elbow's from the backhand.
Yeah, I do neither, but I have actually had both.
Okay. So yeah, you've struggled with tendinopathy. So what would you say are your best tips or most effective plan of action to kind of work around any nagging tendinopathy issues?
The first thing is to be proactive. A mistake that I made in my earlier training years was that I could train around it, so I just kept training around it. And what I do now is as soon as it starts to pop up, I think about how to modify any and everything that seems to exacerbate it. So some of the key...
Have you tried not letting it pop up? Like just mentally thinking like, I don't have tendinopathy?
To be honest, right now I'm doing the highest volume of arm work that I ever have, and it's consistently staying at a very manageable level that has not required me to do things.
Nice.
And I attribute that to my belief. No, I attribute that to actually some of these things that we're talking about, that every time it starts to even get a little worse, I change things. So blood flow restriction training is great. This allows you to use low loads and not have to do a billion number of reps and not know where your proximity to failure necessarily is because it's so damn hard. It's not fun, but it is a little better than, I'd rather do 30 reps than 50 and then be able to drop down to 15 afterwards instead of having to do 25 or whatever. That's great. Also recognizing, like we talked about, I think it was probably last episode, and you've talked about it previously, that for some of the single joint arm work exercises, just being willing to do a neutral grip and not being so adamant about sticking to certain grip variations. I think we're all doing bicep and tricep variations primarily to grow our triceps and biceps. I don't think many people are trying to show off their 5RM on these movements, right?
Yeah.
Even if you are a power lifter and you are trying to get a stronger bench, you're not actually trying to lift heavier on triceps. You're trying to grow your triceps so that they allow you to lift heavier down the track. And you have to have a different perspective on this. You want to stimulate muscle growth, period. Yes, your movements should go up over time. But I think absolutely finding the angle, joint position, shoulder position, and implement that is least aggravating to the tendinitis and tendinopathy when it pops up is something you should be really willing to lean into and not be resistant. Most of the time, my experiences are that I'm taking some time off the overhead or behind the back triceps and biceps movements respectively. And then also going to neutral grip variations of both is really helpful. And then doing higher rep, lower load, and BFR. Also, if you've been doing a lot of Smith machine and barbell pressing, doing some dumbbell work, I find you can kind of naturally find a slightly better position or angle to press with on the arm that is doing that. That can help. And then just another really good one is if it's bothering you on rowing or pull down movements and not as much, and also on tricep movements, which is not uncommon, swapping some of your back movements for pullover based stuff. So straight arm is quite good. If you can do pressing, but it's the pulling that bothers you, I've been able to keep my back volume in by focusing on shoulder extension, and that hits the long head, and then the pressing is taking care of the other heads of the triceps, and that has been really helpful.
If I may, two of the most underrated back exercises in all the land. Number one, the old school Dorian Yates hammer strength pullover machine. That thing
Nautilus.
is nasty. Okay, whatever. Apologies to all the... Are we sponsored now by Nautilus? We must be.
No, you just referenced, an old school machine, and that was Nautilus.
Okay.
Hammer strength has a good one too. I'm just saying.
Okay. So that pullover machine and also straight arm pull downs are a lovely, lovely back exercise, a nice lat exercise that I really don't see getting used a lot or talked about a lot in my neck of the woods. And I feel like they've kind of like been forgotten to time. But there was a time where you would see a lot more people doing them, and I don't think they get the credit they deserve. So I'm here to stick up for the straight arm pull downs big time.
There's been a lot of people in the functional anatomy world who have argued way too ideologically around this movement specifically as to whether or not it's primarily a teres major or a lat exercise. And based upon the leverages and modeling studies, that is frankly hilarious if you just want to see how angry people get and the level of evidence and the quality of evidence they're using to support really, really strong positions.
Yeah.
When it is like, okay, so it might be a little more teres major dominant. We're going to do shoulder extension without bending our elbow, and that's helpful. Oh, and by the way, it might also hit a little bit of chest. So this is a tool. You can use it. We don't need to form political parties based upon how much of a good lat exercise we think the straight arm lat push down, pull down, or dumbbell pullover is.
Yeah. I mean, Helms, you know that I just have no interest in those arguments whatsoever. I think I've...
And this is coming from me.
I
love these. Well. I love this stuff, right? I'm very interested in the biomechanics. If
you think it's an exercise in futility and a pointless bit of argumentation, then that really speaks volumes to me and frankly frightens me. But yeah, I think you got some great tips in there for folks who might be working around some tendon issues. There was one in here that I wanted to address, if I may. And while I'm doing that, Helms, if you want to find something good in the Iron Culture chat, please feel free.
Gotcha.
But we had a question from someone who said, I don't drink coffee because I don't really need the energy boost, don't need the caffeine. Would you recommend that I start to drink decaf most days just to kind of maximize my general health and longevity, i.e. kind of drinking it with a 0-calorie sweetener? Also, question, is coffee bad for your teeth? So here's what I'll say. Is coffee bad for your teeth? I'm not a dentist, but I hear that teeth are prone to some level of staining. I also hear that coffee is fairly acidic and that can be a bit harsh on tooth enamel. I know plenty of people with a lovely smile who drink coffee daily, so I think that dental hygiene practices go a long way. In addition, frankly, this is me with no knowledge speaking off the cuff and just taking a jab at this. I think that some people genuinely have very good teeth genetics where even with just moderate hygiene, they just don't seem to be as susceptible to cavities and staining and things like that. I could be crazy on this, but I do think some people were born with elite level enamel. That's how I'm going to put it. But anyway, so I'm not a dentist. I don't know, but I certainly do hear from dentists and from people adjacent to that it's probably not the best thing for your teeth, but they say that, I mean, everything I enjoy in the world is acidic for the most part, any carbonated beverage, wine, you name it, it's probably, they're going to say, ooh, that's a bit acidic, and, ease up on the enamel. So take that for what it's worth. Now to the main argument, what the question asker is alluding to is the evidence, which is, I'd say, pretty substantial at this point, that coffee is associated with modest positive health effects, which is a huge change because coffee had a terrible reputation 20, 30 years ago. People actually thought that it was this like guilty pleasure and that it actually had negative effects on your health. People thought it was bad for your heart. People thought it was bad for cancer risk. And a lot of that turned out to be very dramatically confounded by, who's drinking a lot of coffee. It's, people who are stressed out, chugging coffee just to survive the day, people who are more likely to be smokers, people who are more likely to drink alcohol. There's all this kind of clustering of not super healthy behaviors and circumstances that go along with coffee drinking. So nowadays, with better statistical modeling, there's generally a lot of acceptance that coffee is pretty good. It's basically water with a bunch of phytonutrients and antioxidants. I will say this, there is one downside I've seen in the literature that doesn't seem to be confounded by other lifestyle factors, and that is there is some evidence. I don't want to cause panic here because it's not like the end of the world. It's not like some ultra strong event or ultra strong effect. But I have encountered some evidence that would suggest it's probably not a good idea to burn your throat regularly. So there has been some evidence that people who routinely drink very, very, very hot beverages before they cool down have some degree of an increased risk of throat cancer from the damage to your throat that can occur with very, very hot beverage consumption. Now, drinking a beverage hot enough to burn your throat is not pleasant. I wouldn't recommend it in any case. And you certainly do not need to consume coffee at that temperature to enjoy it and to, certainly enjoy the health benefits. But that is one thing to keep in mind. Another thing to keep in mind, Helms, now that I'm thinking about it, is the way you make your coffee matters. There actually is substantial evidence indicating that in terms of your blood lipids, it's much better to drink coffee that has been filtered in comparison to coffee that's been prepared with a French press or any other kind of non-filtered preparation method. I think it's maybe Turkish coffee where there's no filter. They kind of throw it and let it settle to the bottom of the cup, I think. And there's a lot of folks that make coffee that way. Cowboys out in the West, they boil up a big pot of water, throw their coffee grounds in it. A little splash of cold water at the top causes the grounds to settle down, I hear. But yeah, there's a lot of different ways that people make coffee without any sort of filtration mechanism. And the filter actually captures something, a particular compound in coffee that is actually slightly, not a huge effect, but slightly negative for your blood lipid profile. So there's a couple things to keep in mind there with coffee. But at the end of the day, I don't think you need to go out of your way to add coffee to your day in order to maximize your health. There are so many different, honestly, eat a vegetable. You're on equal footing. There are so many different ways to say, I want to go seek out some diverse phytonutrients into my diet, some antioxidants. You don't need to go with coffee. You don't necessarily need to go with tea. Either of them would be fairly similar in terms of what you're getting out of the equation there. But yeah, really just as long as you're eating a diet that has plenty of fruits and vegetables, then I doubt you're going to see an appreciable impact of saying, well, now that I've got those extra 5 ounces of decaf every day, now my body's really cooking. So it's certainly nothing that you would have to feel like it's a guilty pleasure if you enjoy it, but I don't think you need to go out of your way to drink coffee in order to support your health. Anything to add to that, Helms? Any skepticism about the claims I threw at you?
No, I was tempted to maybe talk about the timing of the day with related to health, but I think people know that you probably shouldn't drink large, copious amounts of coffee before bed, even if it feels like I can go to bed right after that, because it does mess with sleep architecture, and we've said it a billion times. So I will just say that I'm not going to say it, and by doing that, say it a little bit.
Yeah, and the question was specifically about decaf coffee, so that's why I didn't go into that tangent, and also because it is, if you've been awake and generally listening to mass content in the background, we've railed against late night caffeine consumption plenty. All right, Helms, what do you got in the Iron Culture chat?
I got a quick one, and then I got maybe one I'll kick over to you, or that we can both tackle. Question from Kim Culver. Can hip flexion training adequately substitute for pure knee extension for rectus femoris hypertrophy? This is actually a good question, and one that I feel like I should have talked about more in the past, given my predilections, because there are a lot of people who do experience more knee discomfort when they do isolated knee extension training, especially at a moderate load, or they have to do more warm-ups on the knee extension. That's not an uncommon thing you hear from people, or, the knee extension machine hurts. I tried to do sissy squats, that hurts a little bit, but I'm fine doing leg press, squats, hack squats, and they can, decide how much they want to get their hips involved, and it just seems to not be as much of an issue. People can work around it a little more, but then they're thinking, oh, well, I'm crazy and I want to make sure my rec fem's developed. How do I do that? I've heard that you need to isolate the knee. If I'm doing hip extension, a rec fem's not going to be active because it's biarticular. I think a great way to work around that is actually hip flexion. And you could absolutely do like hanging leg raises or other various, hip flexion exercises. And I think if you're doing them either moderately heavy or reasonably close to failure, you should be getting some good rec fem hypertrophy. I would suspect that the psoas being such a big, strong muscle would probably be contributing a lot. So that's why I recommended being reasonably heavy and close to failure. And then if you do that in addition to some type of squat pattern, which I define very loosely as unilateral or bilateral, with any implement, so long as you're doing simultaneous hip extension and knee extension, I think you probably got your bases covered. So for anyone who is wondering, hey, I've got a home gym and it's not a pain issue, Eric, but I don't have the ability to do, knee extensions. I don't have a machine and I hate sissy squats, or I have to do really high reps, but hip flexion might be a viable option. I think that's a great way to go. Then the longer question, one for both of us, a good question from Sam Brady. Does anything about your usual hypertrophy programming advice change when programming for a male at 35% body fat who is losing weight, especially with the aid of a GLP-1 medication? And then in general, I'm just curious if you have any suggestions around how you would modify programming, volume, frequency, intensity when you're dealing with people with obesity.
Okay, so it sounds like there's two questions. One, do you modify training when someone is engaged in weight loss? And the other is when someone has obesity. Is that correct?
I think it's specifically people with obesity who are trying to lose weight. And
okay.
There's also the interaction, if you think it matters, of GLP-1.
Yeah, I really don't change it much with a caveat. So generally speaking, my kind of default approach is that we are using resistance training as a tool to impact body composition and specifically to maximize our growth/retention of muscle mass. We're not using it as a weight loss tool in my default approach. And what we're really doing is, using diet for that and maybe a little bit of maybe a little bit of cardio or, less structured physical activity, a step count, something like that. So I'm generally not leaning on it as a fat loss tool. I don't think the principles change that much when you're in a fat loss situation, especially for someone who's not like shredded and trying to lose fat. So I really don't change it much. When it comes to GLPs, I think you're just basically saying, okay, let's be cognizant of the fact that we're in a big deficit. And really what that tells me is don't freak out if we run into some fatigue issues. Maybe we will have to drop volume a little bit or make some little adjustments to make things more feasible, but also for that individual, I have that conversation of, are we going too fast here? Do we feel like we need to, make some changes so that we're not in a massive deficit? And ultimately, that's going to depend on, are you 600 pounds on your way to 300 or are you 300 pounds on your way to 150, right? Like very, very different scenarios where, if you're 600 pounds on your way to 300, I'm not going to tell you, hey, we need to slow down your weight loss. Like I'm going to let it ride and we'll tweak the resistance training to make it a little bit more feasible if we need to. We won't cut it, but we'll tweak it. The other thing I would add here is there are some scenarios where I will budge on this. So one thing is like I had hypothetically a person who came to me with obesity. They're not like a super avid lifter. They're time crunched. We're just kind of getting into fitness as a means to kind of like, I heard we're supposed to do this when we're losing weight. I will be a little bit more inclined to tweak the training prescription for that individual where we're doing things that are a little more in the genre of circuit training, where we kind of get that more bang for our buck in that workout, where if this person is like, I'm not trying to become like a bodybuilder or power lifter. I don't necessarily need to maximize my adaptations. It's going to help me psychologically if I break a sweat when I'm in the gym and walk out feeling like I really left it all out there. I will kind of tweak some things based on that kind of combination of background, psychological factors, and just what is this person looking for when they go into the gym. In some cases, it's kind of a combination of stimulated a little bit of growth, got my heart rate up, worked up a sweat, burned some calories. Like there will be some situations where I embrace that perspective strategically, but it's certainly not my default.
Good stuff. And I only have a few ancillary things to add. To your point, you mentioned going from 600 to 300 or 300 to 150. Obviously, having obesity is a broad spectrum. Someone at a BMI of 30 who has an athletic background, very few minor modifications. You might want to, if you got a program that tells you to do dips and pull-ups, you might go, can I do it? Like, am I that strong? Because I'm moving a larger mass than someone with a smaller body. And you may decide to replace that with a machine dip, an assisted pull-up, or a lat pull down, or a decline press. But I mean, we're talking really minor modifications there. Someone with a BMI over 40, it's possible that they have simply not been able to be active because of their body mass, so that they are actually in a bit of a cardiorespiratory deficit. And that's when you need to think about how do I, in a very stepwise incremental fashion, build their workload capacity as they're losing weight, and think about the positions I'm putting them in. You know, there's a reason why obesity is highly correlated with sleep apnea. It's because the weight of your body is actually creating some issues. So it may be difficult if you're, say, a personal trainer or a programmer who's never been in a really large body to know what that's like. And it might also be uncomfortable for the person to talk about it. So you really have to think about what are some movements that wouldn't necessarily put stress on the person. Can I get a seated variation? That's often a good way to go. And are there potentially, standing cable variations of some things? One interesting paper that I saw published a while ago, Trex, you kind of appreciate this, is they determined that it was something like 60% of your body mass is about what you can stabilize and do a standing cable chest press. So it doesn't matter if you're super, super strong, like, if you're a lightweight powerlifter who can bench more than 2 times your body weight, you're not going to be able to brace against anything. But if you have someone who is pretty heavy and laying on their back with barbell or dumbbell in their hands is not an appropriate thing at this stage, what they can do is do a lot of standing cable work. And I did a lot of standing cable presses when I worked with a few of my clients back when I was a personal trainer with obesity. And that was a great variation because they had the advantage of being a relatively large person. So as they got stronger, they could keep pressing, and then they could transition to some of these more quote unquote traditional movements that are associated with strength and hypertrophy training.
All right, man. Good stuff. I got a question for you, if I can jump to the front of the line here. We had a question, is there any specific way to improve training intensity, such as, like one might do with work capacity, beyond the simple suggestion to just try harder? So I think, Helms, I don't want to steal your thunder because I think this is more of a Helms question than a me question, but I think certainly the first thing we'll have to kind of operationally define is what do we mean by intensity, right? Because in the literature, intensity is usually discussed as kind of a percentage of maximal load. At least that's how we typically see it. So, when someone says we're going to increase the intensity of your workouts, they would say, instead of using 70% of your 1RM, we're going to bump that to 85% of your 1RM, right? So in that case, the key to increasing the intensity of your workouts is to do it. Throw a couple, 2.5s or 5s or 10s on the side, right? But I get the impression that this individual is talking about something very, very different entirely. But how do you interpret this question?
Yeah, it was basically the literal words that you said.
I'll give you verbatim. Any specific way to improve training intensity like one might do with work capacity beyond try harder? Just a question I've been pondering.
Yeah, I would say the important thing is defining it here. And there are basically in resistance training, I never use the term intensity. I will specifically say proximity to failure, concentric velocity, or I will say, like you said, load. Which we can express as an RM or a percentage of 1RM. So if we are referring to proximity to failure, which they could be, some of the ways to train closer to failure and do that in a measured way and increase your tolerance to it would be to first get some accurate assessment of how close to failure you are. The things I would recommend is film yourself, rate your RPE or RIR before you look at the video, and then look at the video. You will find that the video will probably help you calibrate it, kind of that observer effect. And you can even send it to someone you know who is a more experienced lifter, who's a little more objective, but who's not just like your big up bro who's like, oh, you always got one more, to get some feedback, or with a workout partner. That's great. And also, I think it's important to know that everyone has a different pain tolerance level. Everyone has a different emotional response to being close to failure, and this varies by exercise. Having done a lot of research on RPE with trained individuals, I can tell you that the number of times that people overshoot and undershoot their RPE differs on the bench and the squat. If you give people a 7 to 9 RPE, which is a 1 to 3 RIR range, on bench press and squat, and you take a group of well-trained men, you're going to get almost nobody hitting an accidental failed rep on squats, and it will absolutely happen on bench press. And this is for two reasons. One, it doesn't hurt as much. Two, you're just not as emotionally tied as a male in our current culture to how much you bench, bro. I got one more. So, and there's just less total muscle mass that's going to create fatigue when you're doing it on a bench press versus a squat. So the things that can really help you train at a quote unquote higher intensity or closer proximity to failure is use some machines for a while. Machine training, there's less opportunity for oopsies, getting out of the groove and dropping it on yourself. If you fail on a machine, you won't get hurt, so long as the stoppers are in the right spot for a leg press or a Smith machine. But plate-loaded and selectorized machines, very safe way to actually train to failure. And if you find that training to failure is really exhausting, that hint of work capacity is making me think of this. If you're currently not training to failure very much, or relatively far from it, and you want to give it a shot, try doing 3/4 of the current volume that you're doing, and then actually take, maybe to start, your last set on every exercise to failure, and switching to machines, or make sure you have a spotter, or as close to it as you feel comfortable going, and then work towards that over time. And I think a block of actually training to failure, actually failing reps, you start to realize it's not quite of a big deal as you think it is. And if the target is not a given number of reps at a given load, it's go until I can't. To the degree that you feel comfortable doing that, you'll probably feel safer doing that on machines and with spotters. And I think that's an incredibly valuable experience. One thing I've reflected on many times, Trex, is that there are people who are coming up in the modern era, and I guess this is a sign of success for some of the work I've done, who the first time they start training, one of their variables that they prescribe is RIR, or RPE. That was not a thing back in the day, And especially in the world of bodybuilding, you were assumed to be taking a lot of your sets to failure, and in some paradigms, all of them. I remember specifically having a conversation with my first workout partner. We were both in the military. He was Army, I was Air Force, and we would have to get deployed at different times and go away or, go home for vacation. And we were like, well, you're home for vacation. I guess I can't get an effective workout because I can't do forced reps. So for my first 5-6 months of training, failure was on the way to where I eventually got, where I did 2 or 3 forced reps and couldn't physically move anymore. And that anchored my experience. And then I got into powerlifting. So for me, it was like, how do people not know, like, when they've got 1 left in the tank or 2 left in the tank? And then I did a whole PhD on the topic, so now it's something I'm super, super familiar with. But I think if you have never actually pushed to failure and you start with the assumption that a lot of your work will be submaximal, 1 or 2 reps in the tank, it's probably more likely that you're always training at maybe 3 to 4 reps in the tank. And when you think you're close to failure, which a lot of people have kind of redefined as a 10 RPE or a 0 RIR, which is not failure. That's the rep before failure, right?
Yeah.
I think some people are just actually not getting that experience. And a really important thing for making RPE more reliable in a science-based setting is what's called anchoring. If you take the more subjective RPE scales out there like Omni or Borg that don't have clearly defined definitions like the RIR-based scale that's more modern, or just raw RIR, it is based upon a subjective determination of effort. And if you take an untrained person or a Marine or a triathlete and you ask them how hard was that, and you give them like a single set of 5 at 75% of 1RM, you're going to get pretty wildly different answers. But if you anchor it and you go, okay, we're going to do a set of 75% of 1RM to failure, and go, okay, that in the context of this set with 75% of 1RM is a 10 RPE or a 20 RPE or whatever your scale is, and then you do 5 reps with it, they're going to give you a much more reliable score that is similar across sexes, training backgrounds, you name it. So I think to get that quote unquote anchoring for yourself, it's probably a good idea to go through a phase of training closer to failure. And you can do that with some of these tools, like using machines, spotters, video, and dropping your volume to accommodate that higher training stress.
I wish I could take your answer seriously, but there's a major flaw, a major oversight. You just answered, you went on and on flapping your gums about intensity, and you did not mention the old training videos with Branch Warren and Johnny Jackson. So would you like to apologize or revise your answer?
And another additional thing you can do on top of that is if you did not hit failure, but you want to appear to or feel or convince yourself that you trained intensely, scream. There are a few options. It can be completely not understandable. It can be something to indicate that despite how hard it might have been, it was nothing but a peanut. You can also just say that it's lightweight, regardless of the load on the bar. And I would also encourage you to take the dumbbells especially, and just kind of throw them on the ground after you're done.
Yeah.
That will
assuming
always
you don't own
intensity.
them. Yeah. It's got to be someone else's dumbbells.
Correct. Because that will definitely increase the intensity if that person sees it and they're physically in the gym with you.
Yeah. I tell you what, man, you could get into all this dumb science stuff all you like, but and I'm not being facetious. There was something special about watching those training videos back in the day. You know, Branch Warren, Johnny Jackson, Ronnie Coleman. They were just something, man. And I think there's the caveat you always got to throw out there is like, yes, embrace evidence, embrace science, use it to your advantage. But you don't have to turn your back on the good old days. Like those videos to me still are just, it's like, are they doing everything perfectly? No. But that is unadulterated passion for training. And throw Dorian Yates in there. You got to throw him in there. Blood and guts, etc.
Find old clips of Tom Platz. That
maniac.
That man is completely out of his mind in the best way possible. The way I see science treks to take your facetious comment and make it serious.
No, I'm being dead serious. That like
I am actually too. Good.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, I mean it. Like I think here's what I'm politely pushing back against is the people who do everything right on paper, but have no idea that they are dramatically holding back effort in the gym and nowhere close to training as hard as they think they are. And they'll sit there and they'll train for 5 years and make very minimal progress and be like, well, I did everything right. I guess I have terrible genetics. And it's like, honestly, lock yourself in the room and go nuts for 50 minutes and see if that works, because it might.
I think science for the type of like nuanced hypertrophy training is best contextualized as a conduit to focus insane energy. Like if you were actually curious about whether or not hip flexion is useful for rectus femoris hypertrophy, you should only be asking this question if you were hell-bent on growing every single muscle in your body. So when I hear that, I automatically relate to that person. But if you are hell-bent on growing every single muscle in your body, and sometimes you're accidentally hitting a 5 RIR when you're supposed to be at a 1 RIR, you are not hell-bent on growing every single muscle in your body. And that needs to be fixed before everything else, for sure.
Yeah. No, I know people will. It's easy to kind of straw man what I just said and be like, oh, so you're not into training like a smart person. No, I am, but I also, most of the people I know who are really into very thoughtful evidence-based training got into lifting way before they got into science and just trained like a maniac for 3 years, and frankly didn't do anything particularly well. But did put a lot of effort in and fell in love with lifting and spent a lot of time on it and ate a lot, and they all grew a ton. They made quantifiably their best gains doing that, and it was only once they realized, oh, that's only going to get me so far, that they then said, okay, in order for me to channel this enthusiasm and energy, it has to be more than beating the crap out of myself 6 days a week. Now we have to start getting smarter about this and channel that energy and enthusiasm towards something productive and thoughtful. So I just think too many people are kind of, inverting the order, and they're like, if I just kind of converge upon the correct evidence-based way to train, which is kind of what like the online groupthink often kind of leads toward, is just like, we know we need to do this much frequency, this many sets, so on and so forth. Yeah, it gets you to the point where you're like, you've optimized the fun out of the first parts of your lifting career and just the experimentation and the go nuts in there and have fun. And I think sometimes ultimately that can have a detrimental impact. I mean, the best of both worlds clearly is that you are remarkably enthusiastic. You're getting guidance from people who have been there before, and you are intelligently channeling that passion, enthusiasm, and energy toward very effective lifting strategies. But if you asked me, Helms, straight up, for your first 2 years of lifting, if you have to miss in one direction, being hyper analytical or just hyper enthusiastic, even if you're doing some things kind of wrong, I would take hyper enthusiastic for the first 2 years. But you're going to plateau hard. And that's when you got to get into the more analytical stuff.
I resemble that. I think ultimately it's apply the same level of enthusiasm to the physical art of lifting, to the pursuit of figuring out how to break through the next plateau. Unless you are just genetically blessed, frankly, you are going to hit plateaus. And if you embrace that curiosity with how do I find a way forward, and you apply the same effort and enthusiasm that you do in the gym intellectually to figuring out a way forward, then you're going to have the best of both worlds. And I think one final reframe before we keep beating this dead horse is that science is about embracing the unknown and answering, or rather asking questions, not finding answers. And we are disconfirming hypotheses. Almost all of the statistical models that we use out there chip away at what is wrong rather than clearly and singularly and with finality defining the truth. So I can guarantee you that maybe 20% of what we think is optimal right now is incorrect, or at least unrefined or inaccurate to some degree. So you can perfectly get the best answer of, what Helms or Trex or Zerdos or the entire consensus of experts and research based upon a super chat GPT 18 version that's out there yet right now, and it will perfectly be 80% right. So at best, that means that what is currently evidence-based is good, but not great. And I'm not saying that the athletes are ahead of the science, because they're doing some things that are right and some things that are wrong. So they might have a different 80% right or 70%. But what they all need to do is to apply vociferous and consistent effort and be excited, enthusiastic. And if you're really, again, talking about the kind of questions where it's like, how do I maximize rec fem hypertrophy? Obsessed. I'll say it. And that is one thing that I will say about all the people who have, developed incredible physiques or incredible levels of strength over time, is they have all been obsessed in a positive way, not to the exclusion of life or their values or anything like that. But it has become something that they are hell-bent at achieving. That's, what you actually do and what guidelines you follow is going to change as science evolves, and that's just the name of the game. But the approach you take to exerting, your will through those guidelines should always be tippity-top.
Big time. All right, man. I think that does it for this episode. A lovely one. We are officially in the 3-plate club with episode 315 in the books. Yes, beautifully pantomiming that big 3-plate bench there. So I do want to say, folks, we love you. We appreciate you. Seriously, coming out every Monday night and joining us is what a privilege to hang out with the crew live. Thank you so much for submitting questions in the live chat. If you want to support, a great way to do it is to join us live and participate. You can also submit those questions in the portal after hours. Make sure that you like, rate, subscribe, review wherever you get this content. Could be on YouTube, could be on one of the podcast platforms. Generally, most people give the highest rating possible. That's typically a 5 stars or a 5 thumbs up, wherever you happen to be leaving your reviews. And then, of course, if you really want to support and show some love, you can join the Mass community and become a subscriber to the Mass Research Review. That comes out every single month, reviewing the newest, best, most useful studies in exercise, nutrition, and related topics. The next issue coming out is a doozy. There's some fun articles in there. The ones that I wrote are about what actually is a diet that's compatible with how humans, quote unquote, evolved to eat. I talk a little bit about the new dust up about alcohol, whether or not light alcohol intake is good, bad, or neutral for your health and longevity. Yeah, there's a lot of, I talked about whether or not calorie labeling on menus and, big restaurant boards, whether or not that actually does anything and is actually useful at the individual level and at the public health level. And Helms, do you want to foreshadow your article?
Well, yeah, I can't tell you how many questions I've got about why long muscle length bias training research keeps flip-flopping. Oh my God, cable lateral raises didn't outperform dumbbell. Oh my God, deep leg press didn't outperform moderately deep leg press. Is science fake? Is this guy falling?
Could be.
Am I in the matrix? And should I just completely abandon science because it's clearly lied to me? Why does it flip-flop? And I explain why through a very simple concept that is actually kind of hard to understand called sampling variance. We should anticipate that perhaps even the majority of studies that might have a small effect like this should actually have null findings. And I have to give a massive shout out to you, Dr. Trexler, for helping me actually model this based upon some, I'd say, well-informed, but still assumptions about what the data might look like, and showing people how even when you know through, because you've simulated the data set, that there is a true small effect size, when we have our typical sample sizes in exercise science, that we would get a ton of nulls. And even when we do get significant findings, it's not going to accurately represent the effect size.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It is an absolute classic of an issue from the whole MASS crew. That's you, me, Dr. Mike Zordos, Dr. Lauren Colenso Semple. So if you want to support the show, of course, joining the MASS community is a great way to do it. That does it, folks. Hope you have a fantastic night and a fantastic week. We will be back with another episode in exactly 7 days. Take care, everybody.